It's time to get hyped, another quarter down, and we've got Palantir's Q4 2024 earnings released in only a couple days after ours. This is for quarter 4 and for full year 2024 earnings preview, where we'll go over last quarter's earnings presentation for Q3 and the metrics there, but also give my thoughts after on the upcoming earnings and what could be the make or break moments in my opinion. So diving right in, they started out last earnings highlights, getting right into some anecdotal data points on how their AIP bootcamps are doing and how quickly they are turning this around. There's no official metric here per se, but I hope to see them continue to highlight how these bootcamps are performing, and maybe they've come up with a metric here officially after running so many at this point. But always great to see them tout these total contract values getting signed into the multi-millions from weeks to months of work, where we know these are huge decisions for these clients to sign on for multiple millions of dollars. But it attests to the value proposition demonstrated with these boot camps. And also, as usual, they showcase the highlights throughout the quarter. Big things happened back in Q3 2024, especially like the S&P. But for Q4, even with the price run-up, they'll probably tout the deals they've gone through and signed on the US and commercial side. So it'll be interesting to see what they want to draw attention to. And who knows, they may be clues on the theme of what they're trying to achieve going forward. Now, onto the earnings numbers refresher. GAAP net income first, rising to $143.5 million in a single quarter. So this has continued to grow as expected, meaning they are responsibly managing their expenses while keeping their eligibility in the S&P 500. And as always, I just care to keep this positive and really just want this for S&P eligibility, following the typical growth company plan, of course, of focusing on top line and then turning on the faucet later on to maximize GAAP net income when they need to. And this is similar to the GAAP operating income. I definitely keep a closer eye on this because it's on a GAAP basis, and for their operating income, I want to know if they're able to make money with their business, and continuing to trend this upwards and staying positive is what I care about. Now, the rule of 40, which is still a more recent metric being showcased on their earnings presentations, obviously looking back in 2022 and early 2023, you can see this wasn't necessarily trending in the way they wanted to, and they weren't sharing that at that point. But since then, they've continued to build this up, and this is simply a rule of thumb used for SaaS companies to show how sustainable their business is while achieving growth. As the name implies, 40 is the goal, and they are clearly exceeding this at 68% as of last quarter. Now, I don't necessarily care for them to max this out of the wazoo, because this is a byproduct of them already performing well. So even if this is maintained in the high 60s to 70s, that's still good in my book, honestly. Now, the numbers with the most eyes on them, revenue. First, for US revenue growth breakdown, which we know is their bread and butter for both commercial and government, they grew 44% for their last quarterly figure. This is something a lot of folks are riding on and seeing overperform, and hopefully, considering this is their strongest market. And then beating out that 44% will be very important to see if money is still flowing in the direction. But just remember too, this baseline will be based on Q4 2023 for the next earnings, and for US revenue numbers, that stood at $368 million. So achieving 44% will be exceeding the $500 million revenue point, around $530 million actually. So we'll see if that actually comes true. And looking at the breakdown too of US revenue, the government side grew at 40%, while commercial was 54%. So obviously with the lower baseline in commercial, we're expecting this to overperform in order for them to hit higher. And I just pointed out here as well for the US government, that's still important for their business, and it is a big part of it. So even though it's a lower growth number, we still want to see them to achieve this higher than that 40%. And further, if we look at overall commercial revenue growth and government revenue growth, so this is including both international and US, international obviously brought this down and weighed down the metrics. One thing to note too is if they bring back the international graphs, which they took out here, it means it's something to highlight again, and they may be expecting something, in my opinion, maybe for future quarters, because management hasn't been shy about switching things around on these presentations, as they should, I believe, personally. You might as well highlight your strengths, and you can always get that filing and then just do some simple math here to see what that international side is. So overall revenue growth is going to be the number I think a lot of people are going to highlight on. Yeah, we can take the nuance of international drag, but the whole narrative now seems to be that growth is accelerating, meaning probably just holding 30% constantly, which is still amazing in my opinion and very hard to achieve anyways regularly, but it may not be enough considering that is a stagnation of growth, although the higher baseline means they are bringing in more dollars technically on a nominal basis. So for Q4 2023, they had $608 million, so that's around $50 million more than the baseline from last time in Q3. meaning their 30% growth on top of 608 million means that they have to bring in around $790 million for Q4 2024. And we'll talk about the guidance here later on, but obviously they didn't guide that high, although we know about their constant sandbagging. And it takes two to tango as well. Expenses and what you keep is important too. Palantir continues to tout their adjusted operating income, representing a 38% margin. This rate has been increasing over time as they've brought in more money, which is the trend we want to see. Palantir needs to be able to maintain their growth activities without spending too much to capture these dollars, and so far they've been keeping up. Now, the other big numbers are customer counts for me. It didn't blow me out of the water last time, but obviously there were other points that carried harder for the last quarter. Their first highlight is that one they always want to show, US commercial count. This has been growing quickly and year over year achieved 77% in the numbers of customers in this bucket. We know this is where future growth is supposed to come from and expected by Wall Street and retail alike. Palantir needs to continue growing this US commercial customer account because it's touted as their most successful market. So we want to see that pipeline start to get filled up at the top, and hopefully revenue figures will follow. As long as the numbers reflect this, hopefully the sequential growth is higher than the 9%, turning this around or showing an inflection point for Q4 2024. Even if it stays the same too, I guess that's okay, but we want to see this trend turn around a little bit faster. And similar for the overall customer count here, continuing to add on and breaking the 600 customer point, which was a huge achievement in Q3. Turning around this sequential 6% growth rate similar to the US commercial customer count would also be a nice surprise for Q4 earnings. Now, the juicy deals next. Q3 2024, they closed 104 deals of at least $1 million, 36 at least $5 million, and 16 at least $10 million. So continue to rack up deals like this, although anecdotal in my opinion, because these deals all have varying time periods. It's still cool to see how they're able to get customers to sign on for millions of dollars. It's not easy to do considering the commitment and investment these customers have to risk and probably expecting a return if you're spending this much money. But probably like those bootcamp numbers given earlier, there's something underneath the hood that is convincing customers once they get their hands on the software with data that makes it all worth it. Now, the treasure hoarder of $4.6 billion on their assets here, ready to be deployed or sitting in U.S. Treasury securities, locking in a safe percentage while they determine the best course of action for this money. Now, for me personally, I still don't see a rush to just dump all this money and try to get growth out of it while rates are where they're at. Obviously, in a very low interest rate environment, my tone will change, but the flexibility this cash provides means they're able to take on a little bit more risk and test stuff out. But maybe Palantir is just that amazing of an efficiency machine where the additional cash doesn't even deploy here and make and drive growth, but rather their culture can continue to maximize their current spending trajectory with outsized returns and continue to grow cash. We'll see if management pivots considering they have the inside look, and whatever Palantir decides to do with this cash is best for shareholders. We do know they may be participating in funding rounds, one getting a lot of attention recently around Shield AI, who we know they're already working with Palantir and are aligned with mission-wise in serving the US government, so we may get a pleasant surprise once we get confirmation. Now, guidance. This is another make or break attention getter for earnings. They've got revenue between $767 million or $771 million, which if you remember what we talked about for revenue, that's below 30%. However, we know Palantir has been smashing their own guidance each and every earnings for the recent quarters. So honestly, everyone is expecting more than 30%, myself included. And this is where I know I stand with a lot of folks where I think it's crucial for them to continue this and growing this top line rate above 30% to justify the price that they're trading at today. Now, no one is saying they have to achieve monstrous points today, this very second, but the trend needs to keep going in the right direction where I personally think just staying right at 30% might not be enough to keep their multiple, but who knows? Now, that was a quick review of last quarter's earnings going onto Investor Relations website if you need to review them yourself. But what does this mean for Q4 2024? Now, we already touched on them sandbagging guidance and what I think they need to hit for top line revenue. What I also think will be crucial for Q4 earnings is what is their guidance in general. So not only hitting and beating their goals, but continue to set higher goals going forward, or at least higher than what's expected, honestly. Now, if we see an outsized growth rate in guidance exceeding 30%, especially for full year 2025, I think everyone would be pleasantly surprised and will no doubt cause excitement. However, if there is a stagnation in guidance, or maybe it's just not as large of growth that people expected, even though we know they typically sandbag, this could be a point of contention. Now, for the margins, their cash pile continues growing as well, and other points that they reviewed. I honestly think everyone is still really focused on the big high level numbers, revenue, and guidance, because what's under the hood seems to be pretty consistent here now over several quarters, where Palantir is a good steward of keeping expenses in line and keeping their profitability. And on top of the numbers themselves, Palantir management no doubt will spin things positively, especially with the domestic US market around government garnering a lot of positive attention recently, considering the new administration that's in. But it will be interesting to see what their exact thoughts are, or if they'll even disclose that, because we know there are big military and US government administration contracts on the line, all while the narrative of cutting costs in the government is floating around. So I'm just curious to know how they view this and probably see themselves on the winning side of things, if I were a betting man at least. So I'll be looking out for earnings on Monday. Lots of excitement going into the weekend, closing out well into the 80s, where Palantir has a lot of growth and expectations priced in, and maybe for good reason. And really, it only does take one jumbo unexpected contract or maybe a change in narrative to blow things up in either direction. So excited to see Q4 earnings coming up. Curious to know your thoughts below, and I'll see you in the next video.